That's the feeling we've all had. How new shoes would make you glad, but the best time you recall when you wore no shoes at all. Back the days.
Some of these areas that I'm patching had pigment on them, so I have to patch them up and then redo the pigment, which might not turn out looking the best because they are patch jobs, and it's going to be kind of uneven. But anyways, when I originally did this pigment on my house, it was something called a Fresco. Often people will pigment lime plaster with a pastel color, so they do a lime wash, which means they mix lime with water and then they add a pigment to that. The problem with that is like it always makes a pastel color, so something blended with white. What I wanted was a deeper color of pigment, and so on my house I did something called a Fresco, which is you mix the pigment, which is basically just ground up earth of some sort, some kind of mineral. This happens to be red ochre, and this is yellow ochre here. Because it's basically just like a ground up colored stone, it doesn't fade, so the color is fast and it stays that way forever, basically. To make a fresco, you mix this earthen pigment with lime water, which is the water that sits on top of lime when it's been slaked. Now this has, it's basically clear, but it does have some of the chemical properties of the slaked lime. And when it's mixed with the pigment, it has chemical properties so that when you paint it on lime plaster that's still wet, it sort of creates a chemical bond with the lime plaster in the same way that the lime plaster is curing and changing into calcium carbonate. The lime water will help the pigment stick to that lime plaster and make a good bond, and that's why the pigment on my house has stayed through all the rain and weather that it's gotten, and it's been up for over 4 years now. And it still basically looks just as deep in color as it did when I applied it. I'm mixing up both yellow ochre and red ochre paints because the orange that's on my house is actually an undercoat of yellow ochre and then a red ochre coat on top of that. And it kind of, instead of mixing the two together, and it gives sort of a mottled look more than a straight orange color. It looks pretty sloppy now, but once I get the second coat of pigment on, it'll basically look like it did before. And as I continue to keep the fresh plaster wet, the pigment will bind to that fresh plaster and it won't really bind to the stuff that's dry, that was the old plaster. And so the pigment will kind of wash off of that. So hopefully you won't be able to really tell the difference after the fact. So for spraying after you put the pigment on, you want to have a pretty fine mist because you don't want to blast the fresh pigment right off of there. But you want to make sure to keep it well wetted all day long, and it's a pretty windy day, so I'm going to have to keep on top of it. And I'll continue to spray the stuff that's even not pigmented, just to keep it wet and allow the plaster to cure. I'm just going to take Banjo for a little walk before I come back and do the second coat. Stay there. That's it. Harness on. You can go first. You want to. You want to. Which way are you going? Okay, she's starting to walk without me. So you don't want to push too much or get it too wet in spots like this, or it will kind of smudge and mix in with the yellow, and you don't want it to mix in. You want it to be a coat on top of the yellow. So you definitely want to be careful about going over it way too much with the brush. You just want to go over it once, lay down a layer, and then when that dries a little bit, then you can go over and get it a little darker. So just need to keep on spraying it, and you kind of know you're a stickler for quality when you do something like this to patch up an area that you probably are never going to see, because I plan on putting some shelving above the door here so that I can get some extra storage space that's up high. So I might actually never see this, but I kind of like to know that it's done right. This part up on the roof is done. Back to being pigmented and not all splotched up. Wanted to show you a little bit about what I was talking about when I was doing that second coat of the red ochre. This is a section that has the yellow underneath the red, and you can see how it's like splotchy like that, and I think that is sort of the goal. I mean, not necessarily to have the paint brushes and brush marks in there, but I think you don't really notice it, but you do notice sort of the yellow coming through the red. Whereas up here, this might be a little hard to see, but this part is a spot where I did end up mixing the red and the yellow in a little bit too much with the lime plaster, and so I ended up with a little bit of a pastel color up there, and that is less than ideal. I think it was because that part was shaded at the time that I did it, and so the plaster, the finished coat of plaster, hadn't dried as much as it had down here. So just keep that in mind. It's kind of important that the finish layer is kind of firm and not too wet, otherwise it will mix in with the pigment layer when you paint it on. Hope you like that little performance of Benny and the Jets. I really was not even paying attention when I was filming that, and was just happened to be humming it, but I think it turned out pretty good. You know, a lot of people are intimidated by lime plaster because either they don't want to use it because it's got a higher embodied energy, or because it's caustic, because it, you know, has to be handled with rubber gloves because it'll dry out your skin, and or some people just think it's too complicated a process and they have to pay attention to it too much. It takes a little too much skill for a sort of what is normally a novice level natural builder. And I think it's not really that complicated, and if you learn the art of lime plastering, you can really do some amazing things that you just can't do with earthen plaster. And as far as for an exterior siding on specifically straw bale, I think that lime plaster is far superior. It'll hold up a lot longer in weather. It's just so much more durable, and then you can do great things like this, you know, this Fresco finish plaster for it, and it also has other potential. You can make a, you know, you can make a smooth waterproof sink out of it, or a countertop. So, you know, if you learn how to do it right, there's just so much potential for lime plaster, and I've been really pleased with how it's turned out on my house. This Fresco that I did more than 4 years ago has held up fine in the weather, and if anything, it looks better than it did, because in the spots where on the west wall where it gets a lot more weather, it kind of, there's tiny parts that have flaked off, and it just makes it look like it's an aged material, kind of like I've seen in Nicaragua, like the Spanish colonial lime plaster that's done there. So I'm really pleased with it as a material, and I don't mind working with it, even though it's got those caustic properties. If you're wondering about the recipes that I've been using during this video for this repair job, the lime plaster recipe is 3-to-1 sand to lime putty, and the Fresco paint or pigment that I'm putting on is 7 to 10% ratio of the pigment powder to the lime water, and I'll put those in the description of the video below in case you want those for reference. Well, thanks for watching, and next time I'll be doing the siding of the Mudroom edition. Didn't quite get to it in this video. It's been mostly focused on the lime plastering, but I think that was a pretty good opportunity to show you all how that works, and it's the same stuff that I did on the rest of the house. So it was a good demo of the lime plaster Fresco. So don't forget to share this video with your friends, and also give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done that yet. And I'll see you next time.